lot of material here. We were meeting with the regional meeting, St. Louis Regional and the IFCA was meeting downstairs earlier. So I went through half of this material briefly with them, and I'm going to finish up today. Here's the thing that we're looking at. Many of you are aware of the new statement on social injustice in the gospel that came out recently. And this is kicking up quite a bit of dust and a lot of division, a lot of discussion and so forth over this issue of the gospel and social injustice and all that goes with that. And this is a big, big subject, and I am not here to solve all those issues in the next 35, 40 minutes, whatever we got here. That's just not going to happen. What I want to try to do, though, is to take us back to Scripture and to address the issues that Scripture gives us on two things. What is the message of the church and what is the mission of the church? Not entering into any large degree with the cultural discussion right now, but basically going back to what Scripture itself says, because that has to be our foundation, doesn't it? The other things that we talk about and enter into this discussion are things that we can talk about and work through, but if we don't have the foundation, we don't have anything. And so we have to start with what Scripture says, and that's really all the time I've got for today anyway, so we'll do that. Downstairs we dealt with the message of the church, or mission of the church. So what has God called us to do? It overlaps with the message. So I'm going to pick up there and go through some of this with you. Just want to give you a perspective that it would not be hopefully any of yours here, and that is the more liberal branch of Christianity. The old school liberals, represented by the National Council of Churches, says this: the central moral imperative of our time is to care for earth as God's creation. Now you notice there's nothing there about the gospel, nothing in there about salvation, about Christian living. It's about the care of the earth. So the National Council of Churches, the World Council of Churches, long ago left behind a biblical gospel. One of the things that this whole series is about, and by the way, I'll give you the website at the end of this time. I told the group downstairs I was going to do that and didn't do it, or upstairs. But you're calling in right now to ask about this. I'll give you the website, and this paper on social gospel and so forth, is two of them are on our website. There'll be some other things coming up soon you can get as well. So these documentations are there. But the early, as the social gospel in the 1700s and the 1800s morphed into Christianity, into the evangelical church in 1880, the early 1900, 1930, as all that came together, the church kind of pulled apart. What was discovered historically, as we've looked at the picture over time, is when you try to blend the biblical gospel with a social gospel, ultimately the tension cannot hold, and the biblical gospel gets lost. And what's left is a social gospel. That's what has happened historically. What we're trying to do here is not just give a history lesson, but to guard ourselves against that happening again. Are social issues important? They certainly are. Is that the mandate of the church or the message of the church? Well, that's what we want to look at, see what Scripture has to say. But as the social agenda and the biblical agenda came together in the 1700s in Europe, 1800s in America, it eventually split in the early 1900s, especially in the 1930s, 20s and 30s, and pulled apart. As that happened, groups like the National Council of Churches and so forth, and the liberal wing of the church, were able to say that the church is all about social issues. So what we're going to do is try to fix our planet of whatever injustices are out there. That's our mission. That's our message. Some of you may have read the book by Shelton called In His Steps. How many of you read that book? Okay, very popular book. If you haven't read the book, you've heard the slogan, "What would Jesus do?" Remember those bracelets some years ago everybody was wearing them? What would Jesus do? What people don't realize in that book was extremely liberal. It was out of the liberal agenda. It had left the biblical gospel, and what was left over was the example of Christ in trying to solve the social issues of the planet. So it was not a biblical gospel. It was a social gospel for the "what would Jesus do" thing. So the National Council of Churches follows that agenda today. Now, Brian McLaren is a modern liberal. He was the father of the emergent movement. If you're not familiar with that, you go on our website to see that. We have many articles on that subject and others. But the emergent movement has died as a movement. You won't find that movement out there today as such. But sadly what has happened is often the case. The teachings of the emergent movement has infiltrated the conservative church, so that those who wouldn't even know what emergent church meant have absorbed some of the teachings of the emergent movement. So Brian McLaren, back in the early 2000s, when he was kind of leading that movement, said this: Jesus' message has everything to do with poverty, slavery, and social agenda. It is not about justification from sin. So a pure social gospel has nothing to do with redemption and salvation. So those are two people that would certainly not be in our camp, but represent the more liberal camp of the Christian wing today. When we think about this, I'm going to give this to you quickly. This is way too much material for today, but again, you can get the website if you want to get the article. But for those that are trying to blend a social gospel with a biblical gospel, what are their scriptural undergirdings? What would be their argument based on Scripture, not culture, but Scripture? And I want to say this because most of you weren't, or half of you weren't downstairs. So I believe that the problem today is that many are teaching a two-pronged mandate and a two-pronged gospel. By that I mean people in a more conservative wing of Christianity are not denying the biblical gospel, the redemption found only through Christ. They're not denying that. But they're adding another prong to the gospel, another element of what is called the social gospel, the social agenda. And the idea there is not simply that social issues need to be addressed, but that it's part of the gospel. And that, I want to try to show you in the next few minutes, is not the biblical teaching. It is not part of the true biblical gospel. Should Christians be involved in the world and in social issues? I believe they should be. As citizens of this planet, as light and salt in the world, you and I should be involved with making this place a place that is better for everybody. I believe that. And so we can be involved in that in many areas. But the question on the agenda is that the gospel, and is that the mandate of the local church? Some believe that it is. This statement on social justice and the gospel, put out by a number of leading theologians, MacArthur probably the best known name, Bodie Balcom, well known, James White, different ones. They're kind of going against this idea. They're trying to make very clear that the gospel cannot be muddled with the social agenda. I don't know how successful they're going to be with this. We've talked about that upstairs. Where were we at? I'm so confused. We talked about that a moment ago with the group. I don't know if this is the right solution, the right forum. So far it's been very divisive, even in conservative camps. I don't know how that's going to flesh out. But I don't think their statement was wrong in what they were trying to do. They're trying to make sure that we understand what the true gospel is and what the true mandate of the church is. It's being interpreted in different ways, but I think that's what they were doing. So, okay, so given the benefit of the doubt that some of our very conservative brothers and sisters are trying to find a biblical basis for a two-pronged gospel, what scriptures would they use to do that? Do they have any? And for you to walk away and say, no, there's none, you miss their arguments. And that's not fair. It's never fair just to burn a straw man. Okay? You should always know what they're actually saying to do that. And so when I write my papers and books or whatever I do, I try to read the original documents of the authors. What are they actually saying? Not what somebody else said they said. So I encourage that in your researches, some of you students and so forth, as you're going in different fields of ministry, or maybe there now, as you do those kinds of things, do the hard work of going back and seeing what somebody's really saying before you tear it down. Okay, so I want to do that with you quickly. Three primary arguments that there is a two-pronged gospel. First, Old Testament Israel. So most of the arguments are based on the Old Testament They go back and they show that God was very concerned with a number of items. And here we'll just list some. God's concerned about justice. He's concerned about the poor. He's concerned very much about the widows and the orphans. He's concerned about the hungry. He's concerned about all these groups that have been marginalized, that don't have a voice, that nobody's taken care of, that are weak. God is concerned about those. That is the heart of God, right? So when you read the Old Testament, you're going to get that. God cares for these kinds of people that don't have the rights, the opportunities, and so forth that maybe we might have. God cares deeply about those people. So you'll get the heart of God in the Old Testament, right? Andy Stanley, I'm just going to name names sometimes. Andy Stanley just came out with some sermons and articles that basically we ought to cut ourselves off from the Old Testament. But the Old Testament doesn't play well in modern times, and basically we should ignore it. He's caught a lot of flack on that, as you might expect from a lot of people. But if we did that, if we followed his example, we know nothing about the Old Testament, which I would suggest his church doesn't, and I would suggest that most evangelical churches today don't. We don't understand the heart of God. There's much there about the holiness of God, and the greatness of God, and the majesty of God, and the praise of God, and the sinfulness of people that need to be redeemed. If you get rid of the Old Testament, you get rid of a lot. I encourage you not to listen to that kind of stuff. Okay, that's the first argument from the Old Testament. But Charles Ryrie makes a good comment on this, that the Old Testament does not command the establishment of justice in the world, nor the care of all the poor and the oppressed in the world. It is more isolationist than the New Testament, but it does show God's love for justice and holiness in personal living. Now that's a pretty good point. Matter of fact, if you really want to be honest with the Old Testament, is Israel the place you really want to go to talk about world justice? I mean, what was Israel's mandate when they went into the Holy Land? It was not setting up programs for the poor. It was the eradication of nations. Israel was virtually unconcerned with as a nation, later, of the nations around them. They were always battling those nations, fighting those nations. Hardly any exception was something like a Jonah for a short time. God's concern was Israel, not with other people. So really not a real good place to go for to find an answer to these issues. Another thought, in the Old Testament, no provisions were made for the destitute living throughout the world. No social outreach to the surrounding nations can be found. Not a good place to draw your theology. Second argument, Jesus' salt and light metaphors in Matthew chapter 6. So we are to be salt and light in the world. John R.W. Stott said, like salt in putrefying meat, Christians are to hinder social decay. Like light in a prevailing darkness, Christians are to illuminate society and show it in a better way. Okay, true, but how do we do that? That's the issue. What exactly, or how exactly would you go about doing that? Francis Chan, who wrote his book Crazy Love, said non-church goers tend to see Christians as takers rather than givers. So salt and light are takers or givers. When Christians sacrifice to give wildly to the poor, then that is truly a light that glimmers. The Bible teaches that the church is to be that light, that sign of hope in a world increasingly dark and hopeless world. Okay, so Chan is saying this, I gave him a quote from him a while ago, that if the church would pay more attention to social issues, then the world's going to like us more. Okay? So if we want to be a light to the world and the world's going to appreciate us as Christians and the church, we need to start giving more money to social issues, and especially to the poor. That would be his agenda. My rebuttal of that isn't what happened with Jesus, who gave his all and he was crucified. And what wasn't the example of the New Testament Christians and the apostles who were largely persecuted and martyred for the cause of Christ, although they were salt and light in the world. In other words, once the world sees what we're really teaching, they don't like us. Now, the reason why Chan's book was so popular is he was saying exactly what the world says. Let's do good to the people around us. Great. But if you don't get down to the biblical gospel, we're no different from the world either. And so, salt and light, yes, I don't know. And here's the third one, and this is a big one recently, the cultural mandate. Go to Genesis 1 with me. Some of you might not be familiar with this. Genesis 1:26. Uh, 26 and 28. This is called the cultural mandate, usually with capital letters. And it's a big deal today over our social justice issues. It says in verse 26, and of course this was at the time of creation, and God said, "Let us make them in our image according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and on every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." And God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, and rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." So that is the cultural mandate, and it is the idea that, too far, I'm leaving out some things here for you, but it's the idea then that God has called us as people, and the church in particular, to rule over this world system. So that the church's mandate is basically to take over culture, to fix all the cultural issues, all the justice issues, the political issues, all those issues. We are mandated to take over the political world, the educational world, the social world, all these things. That's the mandate of the church, based upon the cultural mandate of this passage of Scripture. Now again, we don't have much time to debate this, but I reject this for a number of reasons. First of all, the only time in Scripture the cultural mandate is given is right here. And this is before the fall. There's no sin. There's nothing to rule over at this point. And so when he gave this mandate, the Lord had something else in mind for Adam and Eve to do, since there's no sin corrupting the world, or social issues at all. After the fall, you go to chapter 9, the only other time where anything remotely like this is brought up is after Noah and his sons got off the ark. And you notice in verse 1 of chapter 9, he says, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." That's somewhat like the cultural mandate. "And the fear of you and the terror of you will be on every beast of the earth and on every bird of the sky, with everything that creeps on the ground, and all the fish of the sea. Into your hand will be given. Every moving thing that is alive shall be food for you. I will give all to you as I gave the green plant." Things have changed. They're not to rule over creation. Creation fears mankind, and mankind makes creation its food. Mankind now eats animals. Mankind ruled over animals in chapter 1. By chapter 9, mankind is to eat animals. If you're a vegetarian, forgive me, but that's where you are in chapter 9, all right? So the cultural mandate is not repeated throughout Scripture. It's only talked about at the time before the fall. I do believe, based on Psalm 8 that talks about that briefly, I do believe that the ultimate goal that God will give us in paradise regained will be that we will rule over His creation. But that's not here now. And so when we start saying we're to do this, that, and the other socially based upon the cultural mandate, I don't think biblically that holds water. Because this is not given to the church, it's not given to Israel, it's not given to anyone else throughout the history of humanity until perhaps we get into the kingdom age, to the eternal state. The duty of the church, then, what is the duty of the church? It remains the spreading forth of the message of salvation, that the lost may be found, those found may be strengthened in the faith, and that God may be glorified. There is, in a nutshell, what the church is called to do. We're to bring the lost to Christ, we're to disciple them for the Lord, and we're to glorify God. That's the true biblical mandate for the Christian, and I believe corporately for the church as well. We have this quote down upstairs, but I want to do it again for those that weren't there. Michael Horton really nailed it on this particular quote. He said, "Terrorism, global warming, and AIDS are problems we need to address as responsible human beings, together with non-Christians in our common life together as citizens on this planet. However, the Great Commission is not the great cultural mandate. If we could resolve the top 10 crises in the world today, we would still have the devil on our back, sin mastering our heart, and everlasting death as the penalty. So I think he's exactly right. So what is the mandate for the church? Is the mandate for the church to solve these pressing issues around us? Or is it to do something much more, much deeper in solving the true heart issues of people that deal with sin and their need for reconciliation with the Lord? Charles Ryrie says the Christian's primary responsibilities are evangelism and godly living. Through witnesses, he changes people. Through godly living, he does affect society. And through private and public obedience, he honors God. I'm redoing a few of these quotes that you guys were upstairs with. Kevin DeYoung and Greg Gilbert, both Reformed guys, where we had just before, we had Charles Ryrie, dispensational. Before, these guys, younger guys, they agree that in all our passion for renewing the city, tackling social problems, we run the risk of marginalizing the one thing that makes Christian mission Christian, namely making disciples of Jesus Christ. We believe the church is sent into the world to witness to Jesus by proclaiming the gospel and making disciples of all nations. That is our task. That is our unique calling. Now, why this is so important is once we believe that our mission is something else, it's a social mission, it's fixing the problems of the planet, it's those kinds of things that we begin to believe that's our mission, we lose our uniqueness. And the church is no longer doing what it was uniquely sent out to do by God, to tell people about the redeeming love of Christ and to disciple them for Him and for His glory. And again, I want to draw your attention to 1 Timothy 3:15. For those that weren't there, you can turn to it if you want to. This is such a pivotal verse, I think, in the New Testament on the mission of the church. I go to it quite often. 1 Timothy 3:15. Paul is writing to Timothy in case he's delayed. He said, I want you to know something. I want you to know how one ought to conduct himself in the household of God, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and the support of the truth. So the church is a pillar and support of truth. Now think about that for a moment. No other organization is the pillar and support of the truth but the church. So there's many social programs and organizations in the world today that are doing good work on a social level. And I would not in any sense put them down, and I would encourage you to be involved in some of them if you'd like to be. Peace Corps does good work. Orphanages do good work. All sorts of ministries in the inner city and throughout the world do good work. I would encourage you to be involved in those ministries if you'd like to be. Serve in those capacities. But keep in mind that the uniqueness of the church is that we are the pillar and support of the truth. And so if we're not supporting the truth, we're not proclaiming the truth, we're not fulfilling the mandate God has given us. And we need to remember that. Matter of fact, I got a bit of a pet peeve that may not bother you, but right now the big fad in missions is short-term mission work. So large